Good evening, everyone. I'm Josephine Nalbantaglu. I'm the Dean of Graduate and Postdoctoral Studies. And it is GPS, our office, that organized this event. And we're very pleased to welcome you to this year's Tomlinson Talks. We've had them in this format. This is our third year of doing it. And I promise you a fun evening, really. With these amazing scholars that are going to be presenting their work. So this has been organized in honor of Dr. Richard Tomlinson. He made a very generous contribution to graduate research at McGill University. And I actually remember when this was announced in 2000 and how excited we were at the university about what this gift meant for us. And we've been having these since the beginning because Dr. Tomlinson wasn't the type to just give the money. He really wanted to be involved also, and he wanted to hear the scholars. He wanted to participate in the research that they were doing. So he would be coming and listening to the talks. We used to have them in the faculty club. And when he could no longer come, what we did was videotape the talks, and we'd send him the videos. But unfortunately, and with very great sadness, I think most of you are aware that Dr. Tomlinson passed away in January. And he was 94 years old, and he was active. I think it was Bruce Lennox who was telling me that he still ran marathons in his 80s. So that's the type of man he was. So I just wanted to say a little bit about who Dr. Tomlinson was. And this is the part of the evening that's usually done by the provost, but he sends his regrets. But he was scheduled to be here, but something came up, so he couldn't. So Richard Tomlinson graduated from McGill with a PhD in chemistry in 1948. And he did his research under Otto Maass. And he was Otto Maass's last graduate student. He held postdoctoral fellowships at the National Research Council in Ottawa and at Cambridge University. He joined the Department of Chemistry at McMaster, and he stayed there his career. So he rose through the ranks, becoming chair and then professor emeritus of the department. And he was the founding director of Genom Corporation, so it wasn't the money that he made as a professor that we owe all this largesse to. It was his brilliance as an entrepreneur and a researcher. So the Genom Corporation was a major manufacturer of microchips for digital signal processing, and was also the world's largest supplier of microchips for hearing aids. Dr. Tomlinson made numerous gifts to McGill, so it wasn't just for graduate studies. If you know McGill, you'll know that there are Tomlinson Fellows, there are Tomlinson Professors, and so on. But the largest portion was for graduate studies. So this was in 2000, and the fellowship program was a gift of $64 million. So at that point, that was the largest gift ever in Canada for graduate education. And the Tomlinson Doctoral Fellowships, and you're going to be hearing from the scholars themselves, it's $35,000 a year for 3 years. And at any one point, we have about 24 Tomlinson scholars on campus. And these are pretty amazing students because they also go on to get Vanniers and Trudeaus and so on. So they were very, very proud of what this scholarship has done for us in terms of recruiting the best talent from all over the world. The aim is really high caliber students, and we have maintained his vision, which is that the scholarship is given to someone who's new to McGill. So it's not someone who's done previous undergraduate at McGill and is staying on at the university, but that it's allowing us to recruit external students who are new to McGill to bring their energy to our university. So this has been a recurring event, as I said, and we changed the format about 3 years ago. So you'll be hearing from 7 Tomlinson scholars from a range of disciplines, and that's Also, the beauty of it is the fact that it's across the university. So you have all faculties that are involved in it and showcase the students. But before we begin, we commissioned a very short video on Dr. Tomlinson's life. So this, we're not sending him a video, but we're going to watch a video about what his gift means to McGill. So I'm going to put that on now. I hope you saw how engaged he was with the students. He was always like that. He wanted to know all about them, where they came from, what their research was, what the future of that research might be. So this really embodies what he represented for us. So to go on with the evening, we're very pleased to have Professor Ian Strachan from the Agriculture and Environmental Sciences as our moderator. Ian is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at the McDonald campus, and this is the second year that he's going to be doing that. Ian?
Thank you, Joe. So, we issued a challenge to our 7 scholars, and we said, you have to do a presentation, but here's the rules. You have to do 20 slides, and every 20 seconds, the slide is going to automatically advance. So, challenge accepted? Yeah? Okay. We're really looking forward to these presentations. It's going to be an excellent showcase of the high level of achievement that is the Tomlinson Scholars. So, without further ado, our first presenter is Amanda Jarrell. Amanda, you want to come on up? Amanda is a Tomlinson Scholar in Educational and Counseling Psychology. She was previously a secondary school math and science teacher in Quebec and Ontario, and she's interested in the interplay between emotions, emotion regulation, and achievement in STEM education. Amanda.
So hi, my name is Amanda, and I'm a PhD candidate in educational psychology. And today I'm going to share with you some findings from my dissertation, which looks at how students regulate their emotions in academic contexts. The goal of this research was to find ways to help students to control their emotions so that they could learn more deeply and find success. I'm going to share a quote from the McGill Daily. "Where does the learning end and the pressure begin? They tell you that you can ask for help or kick back with some Netflix, but it will never be enough to calm the anxiety that will surface when you realize that even the action of de-stressing has only augmented your stress levels." As illustrated by this quote, students experience a number of emotions like anxiety, that can be helpful or harmful for the quality of their learning, mental health, and well-being. One problem is that students have difficulty finding ways to effectively and adaptively manage or regulate these emotions. Another problem is that the emotions experienced in academic contexts have been linked to attrition from science, technology, engineering, and mathematics programs, meaning that emotions can have a powerful influence on whether a student chooses to stay or leave from a STEM specialization. But as I already mentioned, students can change or control which emotions they have and how they experience them. So for example, as illustrated by the quote I read earlier, a student might try to control their anxiety by doing something else like watching Netflix. But this regulatory behavior can itself have consequences. One model of emotion regulation is the process model, which is illustrated here. And this model proposes that people can regulate their emotions using a number of strategies, outlined in red, as an emotion is being generated, which is outlined in gray. But for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two strategies. The first is cognitive reappraisal. Reappraisal involves changing emotions by changing thoughts. So for example, instead of thinking of a rainy day as being wet and dreary and feeling sad, you could instead choose to see the rain as giving life and feeling happy. On the other hand, expressive suppression involves changing emotions by changing the physical feeling or the expression of the emotion. So for example, before presenting, I was a little nervous, so I tried to take some deep breaths and I smiled to feel a bit more positive. And these strategies can have different consequences for how people think, feel, and behave. Generally, cognitive reappraisal is associated with favorable outcomes, like more positive emotion, less negative emotion, increases in cognition and well-being, while suppression is associated with the opposite effects. But these consequences can be different in different types of situations. So, while reappraisal is associated with favorable outcomes in situations that are uncontrollable, like trying to change the weather, it has been associated with unfavorable outcomes in more controllable situations. So this led us to wonder, what are the consequences of using emotion regulation in different achievement situations, like while studying and taking an exam, that have different levels of controllability? So we wanted to discover the impact that emotion regulation has on student emotions, learning, and performance. So data for the study was collected across 4 different time points. At time 1, students enrolled in a STEM major reported their demographic information and a required course for the degree that they would think of for the duration of the study. At time 2, students reported how they regulated their emotions while studying for that course, how they felt while studying, and their studying behaviors. At time 3, students reported how they tried to regulate their emotions during the exam for that course and how they felt during the exam. And at time 4, students reported the grade they received on that exam. So in terms of the impact on emotions, using reappraisal during studying was related to more positive emotion, like more enjoyment and more hope, while using suppression was unrelated to student emotion experiences. In the context of exams, using reappraisal was related to more positive emotions and also with less negative emotion like frustration and anxiety. And also using suppression was unrelated to emotions, meaning that using reappraisal was related to more favorable emotional outcomes. In terms of the effect on studying behaviors, using reappraisal, as I mentioned, was related to more favorable emotions, which in turn led to better studying behaviors, like using more critical thinking. And suppression was neither directly or indirectly related to studying behaviors. In terms of exam performance, using reappraisal was related to more favorable emotions, which in turn led to better performance on the exam. And using suppression was directly related to poor performance on that exam. So, The findings from this research provide evidence that when students use cognitive reappraisal to control their emotions, they feel better, learn better, and perform better. And when students use suppression, they end up doing worse on an exam. So the findings from this research provide evidence for how we can support students to more adaptively manage their emotions so that they can feel better, learn better, and perform better in a university STEM education context. Ultimately, this will lead to better overall well-being, success, and retention for our students. So first and foremost, I would like to thank Dr. Tomlinson for his generous contribution to this research and to my doctoral studies. I will forever be grateful. I would also like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Suzanne Lejoie, for her constant support and feedback, and I would like to thank all of you. Thank you.
So I have two questions related to gender differences. One is when it comes to emotion regulation and control, if there's a difference in which type of emotion regulation is chosen. The other is that there's a lot less females in STEM fields than males, and so how that would affect emotion regulation.
These are both great questions. So I'll answer your first one more generally. So the research generally suggests that gender does influence which type of emotion regulation strategy an individual would be more likely to use, where males are more likely to suppress than females. However, in the sample included in this study, there were no gender differences in terms of emotion regulation strategy use. And then in terms of the disparity in terms of enrollment between males and females, I'm not sure exactly what the difference is here at McGill, but in our sample, we did see an overrepresentation of female participants. So one possibility is that this could reflect a selection bias where female students were more interested in this type of research, mainly because they feel these emotions more intensely, so they were more interested. But what I did do was I controlled for the effects of gender. So the findings that I reported were not influenced by gender differences.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Our next presenter is Ellie Good. Ellie conducted her master's research as a Tomlinson Scholar in the Department of Geography, which is also my department, and the Global Environment and Climate Change Center. Ellie is a plant physiological ecologist who explores ecological and biogeochemical consequences of plant functional diversity. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Jed Sparks Lab in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell University. Ellie.
Hi, my name is Ellie. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about peatlands, which are strange and beautiful ecosystems. For those of you who are not familiar with peatlands, they're a type of wetland, and they cover about 30% of the Canadian land surface. They provide us with the peat that we use in agriculture and horticulture and a variety of ecosystem services. And they're very strange because they're actually more acidic than vinegar. They have almost no nutrients, and they're cold much of the year, which means that the only plants and animals that can live in these ecosystems are highly specialized for these harsh conditions, including carnivorous plants and orchids and really tough shrubs like blueberries. They're also what's called tipping point ecosystems in terms of climate change, meaning on the one hand, they can take greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and store them in the peat as carbon, but they're also capable of releasing all of this carbon back into the atmosphere. But why would we care about carbon in the atmosphere? You may be familiar with the fact that greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide depicted here, have been increasing in our atmosphere over time. And this results in global warming and is also responsible for the more extreme weather events like hurricanes and droughts that we're seeing more and more of in the news. So in terms of climate change, peatlands can actually mitigate this type of climate change when they take carbon out of the atmosphere, but then they can accelerate climate change when they bring that carbon back into the atmosphere. So healthy peatlands have been storing carbon for thousands of years, but when peatlands are disturbed, such as through drainage or mining or when the permafrost thaws, then they have the capacity to release quite a bit of carbon into the atmosphere. So what causes peatlands to store or release carbon? And for the most part, this is strongly related to what plants are doing. So you may remember from biology that during photosynthesis, plants will take energy from the sun and they'll convert carbon dioxide into sugar. They'll release some of this back when leaves decompose, but in peatlands, a lot of this carbon is stored in the peat. So you can imagine that different plants have different rates of photosynthesis because of things like size or shape, the difference depicted here between a maple leaf and a duckweed, which are called plant traits, and these can control the amount of carbon that plants are able to take or release. There's this emerging approach in the natural sciences that try to use plant traits like this to estimate carbon under current and changing climates. This was the question I was really interested in peatlands, mostly because these relationships between plant traits and carbon were unknown for peatlands. And this was the question I addressed during my master's degree at a beautiful and large peatland outside of Ottawa called the Mare Bog, depicted here. Mare is affectionately known as the Mecca of peatland research because it's been continuously studied for over 20 years, and it is the longest research station in a peatland in North America, making it a very special place. So I've depicted this area. This is the area where I worked during my master's degree, a little more specifically in this red area here, and this area allowed me to measure plants that ranged from the bog itself, but also into this pond area, which had a variety of cattails, rushes, and other wetland plants, as well as an aquatic plant community. So for 2 years, I measured important greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, but also methane. So methane is also increasing in the atmosphere, and methane actually warms the atmosphere more than carbon dioxide does. So I measured these gases for 2 years, and I measured plant traits. And it was really important for me to pick plant traits that I could measure without damaging the plants because I went back to these same sites over and over again. So I measured a variety of traits, but today I will only talk about leaf area and parenchyma. So leaf area is just the surface area available for photosynthesis. It's the size of the leaf. And parenchyma is this strange specialized tissue that's basically a straw inside of a plant stem. And it takes gases like methane and it shunts them out directly into the atmosphere like a straw. So my predictions were that carbon dioxide and leaf area would be related, and methane and parenchyma would be related. And these predictions were largely met, but the relationships differed somewhat based on the spatial scale. And what I mean by that is whether you're looking at individual plant species or whether you're looking at all the species in a plot, which was this circular area, which might have 2 to 5 species, or whether you're considering all the plants in a community, which in this area could be up to 15 plants all at once. So at the level of plots, based on our predictions, we did find that leaf area and carbon dioxide had a positive relationship, meaning larger leaf area was able to take more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by plants. And parenchyma related to methane, meaning areas that had a lot of species with parenchyma tissue actually released more methane into the atmosphere. And then at the level of communities, we found that leaf area was related to both gases. This is likely because these communities are a mixture of species, some having parenchyma and some not. Also, because of this mixture of species, we found that the relationship between leaf area and carbon dioxide was not as strong as it was in the plots. And then thinking about individual plant species, we actually found that not all species were predictive. So this table shows you that some of these species were significant while others weren't. So I've highlighted the leatherleaf shrub in green and this Canadian rush in red, which both positively related to carbon dioxide, but this aquatic moss in purple actually had a negative relationship. And then in terms of methane, we did find that species with parenchyma, highlighted in red, had the positive relationship we would expect. But interestingly, this blueberry in blue and the aquatic moss had a negative relationship with methane, which is really interesting because it means that areas that have more of those plants are emitting less methane, which is a good thing in terms of mitigating climate change. So in terms of going back to my original motivation for the study, we found that these plant traits, leaf area and parenchyma, could predict peatland carbon fluxes, and that they can be used in a non-destructive manner. So we recommend using them for other peatlands and other ecosystems. And we actually found that some plants could take up more or less carbon, and some even seem to reduce methane emissions. So this work advances our understanding of how plant traits control peatland carbon under current conditions, which can be used to help us understand carbon under changing climates. And it's really my hope that this work has a positive impact on the conservation and management of these strange, beautiful ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Great talk. How do peatlands help regulate CO2 over glacial interglacial cycles?
So they disproportionately store more carbon than they release, because I mentioned that when plant leaves decompose, they release carbon dioxide, but decomposition is so slow in these ecosystems because they are wet and cold, but mostly because they're so acidic that the leaves just kind of sit there. That's why you can have things so well preserved in peat, which we may have all heard about. You know, you have things that are perfectly preserved in the peat because they're not breaking down by microbial action. So the plants are doing photosynthesis all the time, they're taking carbon dioxide all the time, but then they're not spitting it back out like a forest would be spitting it out at almost equal amounts.
And so sort of as a follow-up then, so a lot of models that I'm familiar with that try to understand CO2 fluctuations over glacial interglacial cycles are very focused on the oceans. Are modelers beginning to incorporate peatlands?
So I have two, the short answer is yes. There's a massive amount of research, much of which is actually at McGill in the geography department, to try to model these ecosystems and incorporate them into these larger models. It's a very active area of research. The short answer also is they are complicated and left out of a lot of models. So if you go to a talk really about global climate and you raise your hand and say, are the peatlands in there? They'll groan and say, no, not yet. But they are trying because of this recognition that they are so disproportionately important to global carbon cycling. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Sarah Doody, a Tomlinson Scholar from Integrated Studies in Education. Her educational background is in applied linguistics and discourse studies, and much of her previous research has explored writing in professional and academic contexts. Currently, she is researching written communication in interdisciplinary sciences, focusing on doctoral students' experiences with writing. Sarah.
Hey, so hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm from the Department of Integrated Studies in Education, and I want to start today by thinking about how people become scholars. So what's involved in the process of making the transition from student to master, of crafting a scholarly identity. So when we think about this process, a lot of times we think of people going to conferences and becoming independent researchers, but what we don't often think about is writing. But odds are, if you're in higher education, you spend a lot of your time doing that. And research has shown us that writing is a very important way that people learn to develop a sense of scholarly identity. So in other words, for students, this means that writing is a critical part of learning to become a member of a particular discipline. But recently, I've started wondering about how writing is involved in creating identity in fields that actually bridge or combine different disciplines, about what happens in fields that are interdisciplinary. So interdisciplinary fields are those that bridge or synthesize two or more disciplines in order to approach questions from new and diverse standpoints. Most times these disciplines have been isolated or siloed. But by combining them, researchers are able to address complex questions that they just wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And understanding how these are addressed by using new discourses is important because in Canada, doctoral enrollment in interdisciplinary fields has increased 145% in the past 20 years. But we still don't really know a lot about how students learn to collaborate across disciplinary boundaries. So What I'm trying to do is understand how doctoral writing in interdisciplinary biophysics works. So I explore how learning to write for diverse disciplinary audiences is a very important way that students construct and negotiate a sense of their scholarly identity, how they write themselves into their field, and make the transition from student to master. But to talk about this, we need to understand writing in a very particular way. A lot of times when we think about writing, we understand it as a kind of skill, something that can very easily be learned and taught. And once you've learned this skill, it's a very simple process of transferring the thoughts that you have in your head down onto a page, or more likely a computer screen. So this way of thinking about writing also understands it as being very common sense, as in everybody who can recognize good writing should be able to produce it fairly easily. But I tend to think of writing as being much more complex than this. So I feel that writing contains a lot of hidden rules that we don't notice or pick up on. So writing I view as a skill, not as a skill, but as a practice situated in disciplinary communities, which means that good writing depends on who you're writing for. So physicists and biologists will both have different ideas about what good writing looks like. In other words, they'll produce writing that reflects the way they interact with the world. So one way that students learn about practices and beliefs of their field is by learning how to produce what masters recognize as good writing. But because of all of these hidden rules, this happens subconsciously, and students don't instantly recognize and pick up on these embedded beliefs, which makes it a challenge to learn how to write for a particular field. For doctoral students in particular, this can be very challenging. Doctoral students feel they can't ask questions about writing without looking like they're imposters, and because of this, they're excluded from very important dialogue about writing for masters in their field. So they're left alone to figure out what good writing is on their own to varying degrees of success. And it's more important than ever to address the challenges facing the doctoral population because of its growth. In the past 20 years, as the blue line shows, the doctoral population in Canada has continued to rise, with a lot of this growth happening in Quebec and Ontario. And with this growth has come some tensions, mainly tensions about attrition and times to degree completion. So as you can see, more students are successfully completing their degrees, so that's good. But also, as shown in red here, the times to degree completion have noticeably lengthened, and this is the most recent data that we have about this. And writing is often linked with or overtly blamed for these tensions. And this data doesn't take into account students in interdisciplinary fields. So imagine then the added demands faced by students in interdisciplinary fields. Not only do they have to try and figure out the hidden rules of different discourses, they have to do it for a variety of fields, not just one. And they often don't have targeted writing support. Students have to learn how to write for several different kinds of audiences, and each of these audiences have their own ideas about what good writing looks like. And when we think about writing as a way for students to develop a sense of scholarly identity, it means having to become a master in several different fields. So how do they do this? Well, the truth is, we don't actually know. That's why I'm trying to understand how all of this happens in the context of doctoral biophysics. So these are overtly interdisciplinary programs where students will have to collaborate with physicists, with chemists, with engineers, the list goes on. So what I hope to do is gain a better understanding of the process of learning to write within these interdisciplinary contexts. And this does include, of course, the dissertation, but also other kinds of writing like manuscripts, funding proposals, and conference abstracts, all of which embody these practices and beliefs of different fields. And I hope to shed light on how they develop scholarly identities that enable them and their research to transcend disciplines. By interviewing biophysics students about their writing and analyzing what they understand good writing to be, I hope to understand how they learn values and assumptions across disciplines through learning how to participate in these different discourses. Getting a sense of how this happens, hopefully, will lead to insights that could create support for doctoral students in interdisciplinary science programs. I also hope that this research will help develop ideas about how writing happens in interdisciplinary fields more generally. We don't know much about how writing gets manipulated when trying to reach diverse disciplinary audiences, and knowing how this happens in sciences could help us start to figure out strategies for interdisciplinary scholarship more generally. So all of this will help generate a sense of how writing evolves and adapts to diverse goals and audiences, and how doctoral students write themselves into scholarly identities that help them make the transition from student to master. I'd like to thank Dr. Tomlinson very much for his generous support of this research, and thanks very much to all of you.
So I'm part of a program called Quantitative Life Sciences, which is very, very interdisciplinary. And one of the things we implemented early from the first year is presentation, so that students learn how to talk about interdisciplinary research in a language that everyone can access. Have you seen a connection between presentation skills or exposure to presentations and interdisciplinary research and how that would affect writing?
I haven't empirically looked at this, but I can definitely see how there would certainly be a connection between understanding how to speak to a very general audience. It would definitely be something interesting to look into. The difference between a presentation and writing being that when you write, usually the kind of goals that you're trying to accomplish by doing so are very different from those when you are presenting. So it would definitely be something very interesting to look into, whether or not these skills that are involved in being able to present for wide audiences do translate to how students are able to kind of negotiate writing across boundaries, because writing does tend to be, the word I want to use is a little bit more specialized, but yeah, it's certainly something to look into. Thank you.
Okay, Guido Berman from Neurology and Neurosurgery is our next presenter. Guido graduated from McGill in 2015 with an honors bachelor's degree in cognitive sciences and is now a third-year student in McGill's MD-PhD program. His PhD focuses on using advanced diffusion-weighted imaging to study traumatic brain injuries in children and young adults, and he aims to become a clinician scientist, to practice as a pediatric neurologist, and to conduct research as a computational neuroscientist. Guido.
Thanks for that introduction. So, concussions were once considered to be harmless, but they are now being recognized as devastating neurological conditions and a public health crisis. The reasons are the following. First, everyone is at risk for a concussion. If you play sports, if you drive, or even if you walk outside. Second, concussions are extremely common. Their incidence rates are in the epidemic proportions. Further, the vast majority of them cannot be detected by simply visually inspecting a brain scan, making them a silent epidemic and making their diagnosis heavily dependent on patient symptoms. The problem with that is that when brain damage from concussions is too subtle to produce any symptoms, or when it recovers to the point of becoming asymptomatic, patients will be prematurely cleared to return to the same activities that caused their injury, exposing them to repeat injury and accumulating damage. Concussions can lead to severe and sometimes lifelong problems in learning and memory, behavior. They can increase the risk of psychiatric disorders, and more recently, it's been shown that they can lead to a deadly disease in which the brain dramatically degenerates, as you can see from the image here. Normal brain development consists in a period of fast-paced change during childhood, from ages 1 to 10, then a gradual phase in adolescence, and finally a plateau in adulthood. That makes children's brains the most vulnerable to the effects of a concussion. I hope it's clear to everyone by now that the management of patients with concussions is both challenging and limited. Better patient management requires more accurate diagnosis, better prediction of the symptoms and the recovery periods that people will have to face, and better tracking of brain recovery over time. Advanced neuroimaging is a tool that can help us achieve these goals. The method that I'm using is called diffusion-weighted imaging, and it's a way to study the brain's wiring or the brain's circuitry, as you can see here, called the whole brain tractogram, by taking advantage of the difference in water diffusion depending on the surrounding microenvironment. So what I mean is the following. In the body of a brain cell, water molecules have space to move around, they bump against other molecules, and end up pretty much where they started. But in the axon, or the connections between two brain cells, the movement of water molecules is restricted by the membrane of the axons, causing them to move in a net direction. The technique that I'm using is an advanced form of diffusion-weighted imaging, which, as you can see from the images, yield a much better reconstruction and also more direct and informative measures of brain microstructure. The main objective of my PhD is to use advanced diffusion imaging to better understand the impacts that concussions can have on the brains of children. So the ultimate goal is to improve diagnosis, prognosis, and tracking of brain recovery. And I will now outline 3 projects that address these goals. So first, previous work from my lab has shown that as concussed individuals perform a memory test inside a brain scanner, they show altered brain activity. As you can see here, this brain activity could serve as a potential diagnostic marker of concussions, but the problem is that brain activity is a very indirect measure affected by several things. So that makes its reliability as a diagnostic marker questionable. What I intend to do is to extract the connections between these memory networks and to assess whether the more direct measures that are offered by advanced diffusion imaging can detect concussions more accurately, more reliably than brain activity alone. Second, concussions are all considered to be the same. They're all treated the same way. But the truth is, they are extremely heterogeneous. So what if, instead of being a single disease, concussions were a group of diseases that shared the same cause, the head injury? Further, what if these putative concussion subtypes each had their own clinical profile, so their own symptoms and their own recovery periods? To test this possibility, I will build this. It is called a connectome, and it is a measure of how every part of the brain is connected with every other part of the brain. I will build a connectome for each one of my concussion patients, and I will see if I can group them based on similarities in their connectome. I will then study the clinical profiles of the patients in each of these subgroups to see if they're any different. Lastly, the brain contains major fiber bundles the same way that a city contains major highways. Evidence suggests that some of these bundles are especially vulnerable to damage from concussions. But what is not known is how or even whether they recover over time. So what I intend to do is to extract from my whole brain tractograms all the major fiber bundles of the brain. I will then compare them across 2 different time points, thus being able to assess whether there are any fiber bundles that are less likely to recover and whether advanced diffusion imaging can detect brain damage that persists even after symptoms have disappeared. So in conclusion, concussions are devastating and a silent epidemic. Far too often, patients are prematurely cleared to return to the same activities that caused their injury, exposing them to further injury and more severe consequences. Children's brains are the most vulnerable to the effects of a concussion. Through my PhD, I hope that one day, with a single scan, we'll be able to definitively say whether somebody has sustained a concussion, what symptoms they can expect and for how long, and whether their brain over time has truly recovered so that they're able to be accurately cleared. These advances have the potential to prevent repeat injuries, prevent cumulative damage, and ultimately prevent lifelong disabilities. So I would like to end by expressing, first and foremost, my most sincere gratitude towards Dr. Richard Tomlinson for his generous donation. I'd like to thank my supervisors, the members of my lab, my collaborators, the Tomlinson Talks organizing committee for inviting me to speak, other funding agencies, and last but not least, you, the audience, for your attention. Thank you.
Okay. I'm curious about how you're overcoming the different brain geography. I don't know how to explain it properly, but they're different. Yeah, I think you get what I mean.
Between
So
specific
between
groups?
patients, the location of the brain is usually slightly different, and so when you map it, it's...
Yeah, no, so that's a good question. I didn't want to get too technical. So usually whenever you do group comparisons or comparisons between two groups, what you do is something called registration, which essentially is just bringing all the brains together to a common space so that you kind of overcome those differences. But it is an open challenge, so it's a very good question.
Hi. So in all three of your studies, you're working with children,
Yeah.
right? And so with this registration, are you able to compare like a 1-year-old to a 10-year-old?
That's a good question. So the age range that I study is less wide than that. I think it's approximately 6 to, let's say 15, with some outliers in both directions. For sure, just the registrations tend to fail more often with these people with widely different brains. And it's known that as you start studying specific age ranges, you want to use different techniques. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Luckily for my data set, we're not having huge problems because we chose an age range that is somewhat...
And just out of curiosity, most of these kids, when they have a concussion, why is that? What are they doing?
That's also a great question. It really depends on the place, the country. For reasons that I think are going to be obvious to everyone, in Canada, falls are one of the most common reasons.
Okay.
Sports are also up there, and motor vehicle accidents. I think those are the three main causes, and they all compete for the first spot, and depending on the place where you are, they're different.
Thank you.
No problem.
Great. Thank you. And I really like how you tied in geography, Bianca. Thank you. Our next presenter, Gwen Philibert-Lignier, is a Tomlinson Scholar in School and Applied Child Psychology under the supervision of Dr. Eve-Marie Quinton from the Behavior, Autism, and Neurodevelopment Research Group. Her research interests lie in the cognitive mechanisms and benefits of music for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Gwen.
Thank you. So my name is Gwenaëlle Philibert-Lignier. I'm a first-year PhD student in School and Applied Child Psychology, and I'm excited to share with you my doctoral research on music, cognition, and autism spectrum disorder. So autism spectrum disorder, I'll also refer to as ASD, is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder that is typically diagnosed during childhood. The prevalence ranges from 1 in 68 to 1 in 66 children that is diagnosed with ASD, that is based on North American statistics. The diagnosis is twofold. So first, there's difficulties with social communication and social interactions. So for instance, understanding another person's emotion. And there's also repetitive and restricted patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. So behaviorally, that could be a kid that rocks back and forth. And in terms of interest, it could be a very specific interest with trains or date of birth. The term spectrum is very important because it can range from mild to severe. So not one child will have the same profile. So now, although not part of the diagnosis criteria, it is very common that children with ASD experience difficulties with cognition, more specifically executive functioning. Now, the term executive functioning defines our higher order cognitive processes, the ones that we use every day to plan, organize, and execute our thoughts and behaviors. Executive functioning is therefore very important to manage and regulate our emotions, our behavior, and for children, especially in school, it's very important to succeed both academically and with peers relationship. Now, in the research, there is a big amount of evidence that points toward the role of music training and musical activities during childhood, that it could improve executive functioning, more specifically working memory, which is the part of our memory that holds information temporarily and we need it for decision making, inhibition, which is our ability to restrain ourselves from doing an action, and cognitive flexibility, the ability to switch between two tasks, and we need it to adapt to the changes in our environment. So now, although we tend to highlight the difficulties and the deficits in ASD, music could actually be a potential strength in this population. There's an important body of research that shows that individuals with ASD have a special interest and engagement with music. Some are very talented musically, and they tend to possess a very good musical memory and musical perceptual skills. So based on this, my research question is whether a strength-based intervention using music could enhance executive functioning in children with ASD. Now, a very important focus of my research is a strength-based approach, meaning we start from an area of strength for these children, in this case music, to improve an area of difficulty, executive functioning. So using a pre and post intervention study design, I will investigate whether music training changes executive functioning over the course of a full year. So we will have two groups, a music training group, which will take part in active percussions learning through drum circles, and a comparison group, which will be introduced to different musical instruments, but in a much more passive and unstructured format. So we will take measurements again of their executive functioning before and after the training. And we use percussions because it's a very easy and accessible instrument that requires no prior knowledge of music, and it can be done both individually and in group. So in terms of pre and post measurements, I will collect both behavioral data and brain activity data through EEG, or electroencephalography. So to acquire behavioral data, I will use a standardized assessment, the NIH toolbox, which is from the NIH toolbox, I will use a cognitive battery. So I will acquire scores of working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility. Again, this will be done before the music training and after the music training. And in terms of brain activity, I will use EEG, which is a minimally invasive test that records electrical signals of the brain, so what I'm calling brain activity here. So again, children will complete tasks of working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility while we record their electrical signals, and this will be done pre and post the intervention. We use EEG because it will give us additional information that is not given in behavioral data on the space and location of brain activity. So I expect that those that took part in the music training group after the school year will have significantly improved their scores of working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility, both behaviorally and through EEG. Now, the findings from this research holds the potential to provide novel information about music intervention in ASD. Music being very accessible, an easy tool to use, it can be very easily implemented both in schools and in the community. And again, we start from an area of strength with these children. It's something that they enjoy and that they potentially have a strength in. And finally, targeting the improvement of cognition, more specifically executive functioning, can improve can have a positive impact on their well-being, their mental health, and overall schooling experience. So with this, I'd like to express my sincerest gratitude to Dr. Tomlinson, to my supervisor, Dr. Eve-Marie Quintin, my lab colleagues, our collaborators, funders, and the students, the teachers, the parents, and the musicians that participate in our research. Thank you. That's easy.
Someone who has a question. Go ahead. She's our ringer.
Sorry. So a lot of the symptoms you described in issues with executive functioning are also present for kids with ADHD.
Yes.
So I was wondering if you've seen a relationship.
Well, I'll be very honest because I don't want to go beyond my area of research. I haven't studied ADHD. I know there's a lot of overlap in terms of symptomology and even experiences in school and all that. And it's a very comorbid disorder as well. But I can't really talk about ADHD. I wouldn't want to make claims that I can't really support. But I mean, we never get clean samples as well, so it's very often that a kid with ASD will also have ADHD. So I mean, those are two confounding variables. But yeah, sorry I couldn't answer better.
Great presentation. I know that applying an EEG takes time, and then you need to collect data for a while because it's noisy and you need to average it.
Yeah.
So is it hard to do these experiments on children that, I don't know what their degree of severity is? But
Yeah, it varies. Well, this is the limitation we always have using any neuroimaging technique with this population. But then we decided to use EEG because there's a lot of literature on music and cognition that is done with EEG. And also it's an easy tool to bring to schools, right? Because we can't really have them come for neuroimaging, but we will always have the difficulty of them not wanting to put the cap on, every restraining, that's very uncomfortable for them, that's for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Our next presenter is Omar Kakish, a doctoral student and Tomlinson Scholar from the Department of English. His research interests include Arabic literature in 19th century Britain, Orientalism and the history of the 1001 Nights, and translation studies. He has taught writing and rhetoric, cultural studies, English literature, and Arabic in the US, Canada, and Jordan. Omar.
Hi everyone, I'm Omar Kakish. I'm honored and excited to be here to talk to you today about some of the research I've done on the translation history of the Arabian Nights. In the next few minutes, I hope to highlight some of the ethical and political stakes involved in this seemingly innocuous historical account. My work on the Nights reflects the larger methodological concern in my dissertation with translation. Is it a song? Oh, there it is. Not just as a form of linguistic domestication, but as a mode of knowledge and power transfer with a particular focus on the place of Arabic within contemporary debates of world and post-colonial literatures. So my starting point is translation. And this is a mode of communication and creation we all engage in all the time in our wonderful multilingual city. We often think about translation in terms of accuracy and fidelity to an original language. But my research joins a modern trend in thinking of translation as a complicated form of authorship. When it comes to the Arabian Nights, most people still think of this as a translated collection of an Arabic original. In the European imaginary, the Nights is to Arabic and the Arab world what the likes of Homer, Virgil, and Ovid are to European literatures and languages. Which is why I've been so surprised throughout my childhood by the fact that growing up, I found Dante and Homer and Shakespeare in Arabic in my grandfather's library, but never this, Arabic masterpiece of the Arabian Nights. So what is this thing called the Arabian Nights? Is it a collection? Is it a genre of writing? Should I say the Arabian Nights is or the Arabian Nights are? Is it the name of a mythology? Where does it come from? And more importantly, how can studying the translation history of this phenomenon inform the process of demythologizing the non-European other within the Western imagination? You might think that this doesn't apply to you, that you haven't had much contact with this text, but the truth is that Arabian Nights has oversaturated every aspect of the Western imaginary for nearly 3 centuries now. And if these images don't ring a bell, then surely the one that will come up now will. Everyone here has encountered the 1001 Nights in one way or another. But these iterations of the Nights over the past 300 years, Aladdin included, reflect more accurately the way in which the West imagines the Arab world, more so than any Arabic original source materials. In other words, while historical evidence clearly supports the notion that an Arabic collection of the Nights circulated in the 10th century in Baghdad, much of these stories are lost today. And what we have are fragmented manuscripts of only a few hundred nights. So where do we get the 1,000 nights from if we only have a few hundred? Well, it all starts in 1704 with Antoine Galland's publication of a translation of an Arabic manuscript. This creates an insatiable public thirst for this new genre of writing, and within a year, pirated copies and English translations of this flood England. It might interest the audience in this room to learn that by the late 1700s, English translations were brought to Montreal and Halifax and Philadelphia and New York and even Sydney. And I draw your attention to the fact that this network of dissemination is closely tied to the imperial projects of England and France. So with Galland's translation, the public is introduced to Shahrazad, the learned and wise woman who acts as a frame narrator. She tells the despotic King Shahryar's story each night to prolong her impending death. And so under this pretense, a collection of stories that span 1001 nights is born. But Galland's manuscript, which we have today in the Bibliothèque Nationale, contained around 280 nights. And when his materials ran out, the publishers demanded more. The marketplace wanted more nights, and so it got it. These nights were haphazardly compiled, suddenly discovered, fabricated, and then back-translated into French. By the 19th century, European interest in the nights reached such intense heights that Oriental scholars started compiling Arabic editions under the pretense of translating extant Arabic texts. They produced the materials and then translated them into their languages. The ethical problem of these translations now becomes clear. These texts purport not only to entertain readers, but to inform them with scientific and historical data on the customs and manners of the Orient. They're being received as anthropological studies, and they're claiming to be iterations of high Arabic literature. But while they pretend to be accounts of the other, these translations are very much stories of the self. My research focuses on Richard Burton's text, which caused much scandal in Victorian England for being deemed too pornographic. For Burton, though, the translation was an excuse to enter the domestic conversation about sex and sexuality. He tries to shock his readers out of what he sees as Victorian prudishness with the extensive footnotes and essays that he adds to his translation. So I argue that we must read Burton's translation as a product of British Orientalism and not an Arabic artifact in translation. This shift in thinking allows us to emphasize the translational mode as one of authorship. Translators are authors, and as authors, their texts must enter the so-called British canon. Now, I'm not saying we need to appropriate another text from Arabic. What I am saying is that I'd like to introduce an ethics of translation that reveals the imperial and colonial stakes in a textual history like this one, and in so doing strip texts like this one of their pseudoscientific historical value and read them for what they are, colonial discourses. So thank you very much for being here. I'd like to thank Dr. Tomlinson for the support that we have to do this research. Thank you.
Just wondering how come you didn't reference the Persian origin of 1001 Nights?
Oh, there's so much I didn't reference because
No,
the 20
the thing
minutes.
is,
Yeah.
they're referenced always as Arabic, but they're actually translation from the Persian original, so...
Well, it's a little more complicated. I mean, by the 10th century, there is a complete collection in Arabic, and this collection comes into Arabic from Indo-Persian and Greek sources. So it's very much a text in translation throughout its history. It begins, with the Indo-Persian sources, and then it picks up stories as it moves along.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. You mentioned that, well, your grandfather's library, and I just wondered if The Arabian Nights is not a book that is representative of literature in the Arab world nowadays. What is a book that is?
Well, I mean, the problem with the Arabian Nights as an example of kind of the great Arabic epic is that the great Arabic epic doesn't exist in the European sense. The medieval Arabic tradition values poetry, for example. The Arabian Nights doesn't fulfill the characteristics that classical Arabic literature ought to have in the view of many scholars, which is it's not a text with an author. It's not a text that's being taught. It's not a text that's being annotated, and I forget the fourth one. But so the poetry is still held. The standard of classical Arabic poetry is a standard of high literature in Arabic.
Our final presenter is Renaud Boucher-Browning, a Tomlinson Scholar from Performance Studies, who is currently pursuing a Doctor of Music in double bass performance. He holds bachelor's and master's degrees from Rice University in Houston, Texas. He then studied for 1 year in Paris with world-renowned bass luminary Francois Rabath, who awarded him diplomas in performance and teaching. He performed in the Schleswig-Holstein Festival Orchestra in Germany over the past 2 summers. Renaud.
Good evening. My name is Renaud, and I am a doctoral candidate at the Schulich School of Music, where I study double bass performance. The double bass is the largest and the lowest of these bowed stringed instruments. And in the modern symphony orchestra, it is found at the back of the ensemble because it is the foundation of the orchestra. But sometimes, double bassists can appear at the front of the orchestra when they perform a concerto as the soloist, much like the violinist in this picture. A double bass concerto performed by me sounds a little bit like this. Not to be confused with the credenza, which is a piece of furniture. The cadenza is the climactic moment in a classical concerto when the orchestra suddenly stops playing and leaves the soloist to improvise a dramatic section of music full of virtuosity, all by themselves, on the spot. Modern bass players, when they perform concerti, have various options when they approach the cadenzas. Some leave them out entirely, while others play cadenzas written by other composers. Some, myself included, compose their own cadenzas and are well prepared for the concert. But no one yet in the bass world has learned to improvise their own cadenzas. Because improvisation requires a very different skill set than that of the modern classical musician, who, like figure skaters, rehearse a routine learned from a written script until it is perfect, and then they stand and deliver. But in the 18th century, performers were also composers, and they would compose on the spot. This takes a great deal more risk-taking, spontaneity, and freedom of expression, much like what you need to play on a hockey team, as opposed to being an executor of musical notation. Just as figure skaters and hockey skaters use very different equipment, i.e. their skates, their helmets, their padding, or lack thereof, bass players over the course of musical history have used very different types of basses. Some of these basses had 3 strings, others 4, 5, or even 6. I have a bass with 4 strings. So when I play music written for a 3-string bass or a 5-string bass, something gets lost in transcription. Now, these two composers, bass players, and performers were contemporaries of Beethoven, in Dragonetti's case, and Mozart, in Sperger's case, in Vienna. And they wrote very different music because they had different instruments. One had 3 strings and the other 5. Dragonetti played with this type of bow, which is much different than the type Sperger used, not just in its shape and its size, but in the type of articulation that it brings from the string. And so these musicians, using different equipment, produced different musical languages. And it is this musical language that I seek to understand in order to recreate the style of improvisation that they would have undertaken in their respective cadenzas when performing. And so, in this manuscript of a bass concerto, I will draw your attention to the bird's eye symbol. This symbol, called a fermata in Italian, denotes the presence of a cadenza. There's something missing between the 2 bird's eye symbols. The first one shows where the orchestra stops, and the other one shows silence, a gap. My goal is to fill that gap, but how? In this manuscript of another bass concerto, we see the same 2 symbols now as bookends, one at the start and one at the end of a notated cadenza. It's a miracle. We have a cadenza. We found one. Notice in the upper left it says number 1. And on the next slide, which is from the same page, we have number 2, and there's another cadenza. Again, bookended by the fermata symbol, the bird's eye symbol. This one is different than the other one. Sperger must have had so many good ideas in his cadenzas that he needed to write them down so he wouldn't forget them. But when he performed, who knew which cadenza he would play, whether he'd play a new one entirely? Because cadenzas, like good meals, have different ingredients. This one shows on the top line double stops, which means that the bass player plays 2 notes at a time. In the second line, you see a bunch of fast notes all at once, and in the bottom line, you see high notes, which are very fun on the bass. You have to reach up quite high. My thesis consists of a systematic evaluation of these musical skills which a bass player would need in order to improvise their own cadenzas live in a concert. This research will have a 2-fold impact by empowering performers to improvise their own cadenzas and by engaging audiences through spontaneous performances. So here we go. You're a soloist. Choose your own adventure. Improvise a cadenza. How? Well, it helps to have a lot of different options, different musical devices with which to quote a tune that you played earlier in the movement, or perhaps to allude to a figuration from another part of the music. And so, my goal is to create a methodology to teach students this practice so that it can return to the musical stage for audiences to enjoy. And with that, if you would like to hear me improvise a cadenza live in concert, you are all invited to my first doctoral recital, which will be in 1 month on Saturday, May 12th, the day before Mother's Day. With that, I would like to express my heartfelt appreciation to Dr. Tomlinson for his support of my research and all of our projects. And I thank you for your attention this evening.
So when I learned to play the piano, there are musical scales. I think that's the word in English. do you have the equivalent? How do you practice going from down to low, and would that help improvisation?
By all means, yes, one must practice one's scales and one's arpeggios, les gammes et les arpèges. But if a musician only knows scales and arpeggios, it's like a comedian reading from a script, word by word. Whereas what a comedian needs is this fluency to make it up as they go along, using whichever words they need. And so instead of rote memorization, it is instead creativity, imagination, and inspiration that we need to instill in the next generation of musicians, because it's far more fun. And this transcends the technical boundaries of the instrument, just as we transcend the grammar and syntax of our language. And it makes the music an instrument of personal expression rather than simply recreating a previously made work. So ultimately, performers need to be composers. They can be composers. And improvisation is that melting pot where it can all happen.
We'll have lots of time afterwards, okay? So I invite all 7 presenters to stick around if you can, because I know that there's going to be a lot more, including I just interrupted one who has a question for you, so you go grab him right afterwards, okay? I'm going to pass things back over to Dean Nalbantaglou to provide some closing remarks. Joe.
I just want to congratulate everyone for these presentations. They were wonderful. So a hand for all our scholars. And I think we have some gifts. So do you bring them up? What I also want to tell you is that we had 7 who presented, but we have a lot of other scholars in the audience too. So whenever we mingle during the cocktails, please talk to everyone that you see, and because we have a lot of other Tomlinson scholars who presented previously or who have yet to present, but they're all in the audience. And I think we have a gift for Ian also for having done such a great job.